So today on Meet the Storytellers, I'm delighted to be joined by a friend. We met when I wrote him a letter last year, an actual handwritten letter. And why did I write him a letter? Because I read his book, because I read this book. And his story connected with me so deeply. It was like a magnet, because I saw something of my own story in his. And that, I guess, is the power of a story, right? It can connect two strangers. And that is why we are both here today. So welcome, Jerry Colonna.
Oh, thank you, Ian. And what a delight. And I will tell you that handwriting a letter is what got my attention because it happens so infrequently. It happened a bit after the book came out, but it still happens so infrequently that it actually caught my attention and made me say, who is this character?
Yeah. Well, I was pleased that it had that reaction. I don't always write a handwritten letter, but I was moved to walk down to my mailbox here by the Thames Estuary and post it off to Boulder, Colorado, which is where I find you today. And Jerry, I want to explore in the next kind of 30 minutes your relationship with stories. And while I was having lunch today, I was looking back through Reboot, and I found myself, I'm not sure why, I kind of flipped it open like you do, and I found myself, Jerry, on the author's note towards the back of the book. And I just want to read out a little bit that you said there. You said, I am, after all, holder of stories of the heart, and we are a tribe of warriors sitting around the campfire, using tales to make sense of an insensible world. And I thought, wow, yeah, that is why we tell stories. So let's just start with your relationship. What is it about stories that are so magnetizing for you?
Well, I suppose for those who haven't read the book, I should take 10 seconds or so and explain Holder. Holder of Stories of the Heart was the name that I received on a multi-day quest, a water-only fast that I did in the desert in Utah. And to be clear, there was no plant medicine, there was no ayahuasca, there was nothing going on there. But when that name came to me, it helped define me. And it helped me navigate through the question of, who am I? What is my work to be done? And what's important about the name to recall are there's sort of two pieces. One is holder, and the second is stories. And holder means holding, not fixing. Holder means containing, not changing. And why is that important? Because the stories that we tell are a truth. More often than not, as I wrote in the author's note about my own story, it's the truth, not the whole truth. It's the truth that, and again, if you go back to that image of us sitting around a campfire, terrified about what's in the dark, and the only source of light is the shared fire, and really the hearth that exists there, and the exchange that goes back and forth. What's happening in that moment is that we, as humans, are looking out into the darkness saying, what's out there? And how do we exist? And the truth is, fiction and nonfiction stories and parables have been ways in which human beings have made sense of the world. You know, sometimes there's, this may get me in trouble, but sometimes there's too much fear around veracity and contradiction. When we share stories about who we are and how we are and what the world is, we get a little too frightened about someone standing up and saying, well, but that's not the way it happened this way.
Right.
And I think the power of a good story is in the truth that it's conveying through the structure of the story.
Yeah. And I guess the wonderful thing about this book is that it's full of stories about a young boy in Brooklyn, a young man in New York City, also a story about associates of yours walking with Andrew around the lake, other stories of people that have been on the Reboot boot camp. But I guess at its essence, because while we're here now, it made the reader, in this case, me, feel something. And it does that through a device called storytelling. It's full of stories, and it wouldn't have the same impact, would it, without the stories? Now, when I was rereading it, full disclosure, I didn't fully reread it. I will get around to that soon, but I was just dipping through it, Jerry. Something really struck me about what a master storyteller Jerry Colonna is, right? Because, and bearing in mind, I teach storytelling, right? I teach storytelling to organizations. But I came across a start of a paragraph. It's a typical way you tell a story, and it's such a case study in how to start a story. Would you mind if I read it out? It's chapter...
No. Which chapter is it?
Chapter 5. We sat at the kitchen table. A lit Winston burned in the Bakelite ashtray. My dad in his usual seat at the head of the table, and I to his right, picking at a tear in the vinyl tablecloth. My mom in an apron, paced around the kitchen, walking in and through the swirling cigarette smoke. Now, that setup, I was running a workshop only last week for a global organization, talking to them about best practice, how to start a story. You know, I'm just curious. I never noticed it before. Where did that come from? Where's that in Jerry? You know, that master storyteller.
Well, what you just made me flash back to is being a college student and desperately wanting to learn how to write. And I remember reading, I think it was a John Cheever short story. And I don't remember the short story, but I remember the scene. And in the short story, there's a young man sitting in wearing a white t-shirt with the sleeves rolled up. So this is sort of like what I'm wearing, right? Trying to look tough, leaning on a car, baking in the sun. And I remember Cheever giving two precise details. One was the faint tick, tick, tick of the car metal shifting as the heat settled in. And the young man is eating hi-ho crackers. Not just crackers, hi-ho branded crackers. And there was a realization that, again, this is counterintuitive for those who are not dedicated to the craft of storytelling. The story we tell ourselves is that if I give specific details, it's going to exclude people from understanding and relating to the story. But that's actually not the way humans are organized. The more precise the details, the more you place people into the scene. Tick, 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 hi-ho crackers, rolled up sleeves. The more precisely you do that, the more you can then open their heart so that they can hear the truth that you're trying to convey. And so I suppose there's technique there, and that's what you're calling out, is the technique. And I learned that technique as a young man. I was going to say as a child. Clearly, because I remember that short story, I learned that technique by reading obsessively. I learned that technique by working with teachers who wrote. And to be fair, I also learned that technique when I was a journalist.
Sure.
Because the thing that people don't understand is that journalism is also storytelling.
Okay.
And there may be facts that you're trying to convey, but if you convey those facts without story, they will not stick in the human heart. So I think that's where I learned it.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I love that you can remember those details, and I can feel the heat as you recalled it.
Can I add one other thing?
Yeah.
And this is what I did with the opening of most of the chapters. By recalling those scenes, and by recalling, because the opening of chapter 1, for example, I think the line is, "Mom was my Monopoly buddy," which is not the way most business books start, right? And the effect it also had, it wasn't just bringing the reader to that emotional place. It was bringing me to the emotional place.
Got it.
Because if I, as a storyteller, am not present, then the story will not land and the truth will not be told. So even hearing you read my words back brought me back to that kitchen table, literally picking at the vinyl. And by the way, the black Bakelite ashtray, when that detail came out, and my siblings read the book, I have 6 siblings, they were like, "Oh my God, the black ashtray." Yes. Right.
Oh, I love that. I love that detail. And I love that you put that in there, not just for the audience, but for you to get in the right place emotionally with that memory.
Well, to be fair and honest, it was actually primarily for me.
Okay.
And then secondarily for the audience.
Well, even better.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing that's at the heart of the book, which really interests me and I kind of tuned into, is that relationship between the stories of our past and who we are professionally, and that whole idea that sits not just across your book, Jerry, but across your coaching and across your leadership development firm, Reboot, is that idea that if we want to reboot ourselves professionally, we need to get a relationship with our past and unearthing the stories of that past. And I know it's kind of a big question, but I wonder whether for people watching this who are like, I don't know, you know, what's my past and my childhood got to do with how I lead? I mean, kind of obvious question, but how do you deal with that for the people, for the non-believers?
Well, the simplest things, the simplest way to understand this, first I'll quote Carl Jung, who said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." And I love that line. I love that you will call it fate. Yeah, so I always end up getting fired after 2 years. Yeah, so I always end up in arguments with my boss. Yeah, I always end up dating the same person. It's not fate. It's structure. Or as I say in the book, it's subroutines, it's programming, it's belief systems. And to me, the best way to unpack and get ahead of those belief systems is by examining the stories that we tell ourselves. Because there are those, right? We've been talking about stories that we tell the world, but of course there are stories that we tell ourselves.
Yeah.
So a story that we might tell ourselves is that it's safer to be anxious than angry. That's not a truth. It's a story. It's a belief system. And more important, it's a belief system that has a storyline attached to it that might go something like this. When I was a child, I watched my father hit my mother. Now just feel the fear that came up with that. by unpacking the story, what did that child witness? We make the belief system conscious. We elevate it. So then as adults, as leaders, we get to choose. Is it true that it's better to be anxious than angry? Not necessarily. Anger in the service of justice is love in action. Anger attached to violence is very different than anger attached to compassionate action. So by elevating the story, by unpacking that story, we get to then choose what belief system we want to have.
Right. So at the heart of that unearthing is a process you call radical self-inquiry.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wondering, for people that don't have the opportunity to come on one of your boot camps or have a relationship perhaps with a therapist, or there's a way in which they can do that. I mean, what's the starting point for a grown-up to begin that process of radical self-inquiry, or you know, they need to seek the help of a wise sage to help them on that journey?
Well, there's something to be said for wise sages, right? It's the core of my business strategy. No, just kidding. I think the most important tool for that inquiry process, and this shouldn't be surprising, is a question. What we call open and honest questions. Open because there is no yes or no answer to the question. Honest in the sense that the question doesn't have a presumed answer. So for example, if I said to you in this particular tone, Ian, have you ever considered going to therapy? That's not a particularly honest question. I'm driving home a point. So at the end of each chapter of the book, having told lots of stories to make a point, what I wanted to do was, rather than have exercises or workbook kinds of things, what I asked was a series of questions. So again, if you remember from chapter 1, in which I tell the story of my grandfather's relationship with lemon drops, which is a sweet little candy, and how I associated lemon drops with having enough, and in this case, enough money to feel safe and secure. After having told that story, the question I asked is, what is your relationship to money and how did it get formed? Which of your parents may have been more concerned about money, anxious about money? And why might that have been so? You know, I'll tell a quick story. Dan Harris is a news, I guess you would call him a newsreader here in the States. He is the host of a weekend news show called Good Morning America on ABC. And we did a public talk last year, and we were talking to this question. And I asked, and one of his challenges is that he came to me because he was working 3 jobs simultaneously. And he was exhausted. And as we started to unpack it, what was behind it was a fear of not having enough money. And as we started to unpack that, I asked him about his childhood. And what he told me was he grew up in a perfectly idyllic childhood where his parents had plenty of money. They were both doctors. But of course, they didn't turn the heat on in the winter because they were worried about spending money. So then as I probe deeper, it turns out that he has an uncle who, after going bankrupt, had killed himself.
Wow.
And so the root belief system behind that entire story about I have to work 3 jobs to stay safe routes all the way back to, and if I lose money, there's devastation waiting. He's now down to 2 jobs.
Wow. Yeah, fascinating. I think that relationship between our story and why we do what we do in our behavior is fascinating. I mean, perhaps on a less deep level, or I don't know why I preface it with that, but one thing I found myself doing this summer, Jerry, as I know quite a few people have in this kind of age of lockdown, is doing some reflective work. And one way that manifested for me was up actually in the attic here. I've got some storage areas where I unearthed an old box of unsorted photographs that once would have been in an album, and they're in a box, and they're from my childhood, from my teenage years, my life as a young man. And I wasn't necessarily going through that with a question, back to your radical self-inquiry concept, but I was certainly found that going through them, and really I was just kind of going through old artifacts. There wasn't a big agenda for it, Jerry, but what I did find was that it wasn't just a nostalgia trip. It was actually really helpful about kind of figuring out who I really am, paying attention to, I know you know the work of John O'Donoghue, but I think that sense of interiority, that sense of, as I say, to an outsider, it might look, a bit kind of self-indulgent nostalgia trip, but I found that really powerful in terms of giving me some ingredients from my life stories to be kind of foundation stones for here I am in my early 50s. And I just wonder what your take is on that, because that's not necessarily around radical self-inquiry, but it's around that inward reflection.
I'm smiling because I hear things in what you just asked. So buckle in. There is nothing self-indulgent about being self-reflective. That's a story that you tell yourself. It's a belief system that goes back to childhood. The start of the question, you talked about the fact that in this pandemic lockdown period, like a lot of folks, you were reflective. So let me reflect back an observation. So during a time period where mortality and death were right in front of our eyes, during a period where death and mortality were right in front of our eyes, you opened up the box of your past and flipped through the photographs of your past selves. And in that process, you came to look at the question again of who am I as a man in my 50s? Tell me again how that's self-indulgent. Tell me again how that's not radical self-inquiry.
Yeah, I'd never seen it, because you're right, of course, but I've only just had that reveal. I was dismissing it as something, this thing. And up to 90 seconds ago, I wouldn't have called it radical self-inquiry, but that's...
No, you were all prepared to identify it as indulgent.
Yeah. Well, I guess I knew that it might be seen as indulgent. I found it powerful, and I found it constructive, and I found it magnetizing. Keep on using that word. So yeah, I loved it, I guess, because it maybe unlocked chapters of my life that I maybe forgotten about, and that's the lovely thing about visuals, isn't it? You go, oh yeah, who was he then? Well, who was he and then? And looking back. Well, thank you for the reference.
What did you think of the way I related your story back to you? Well, because I took the words, but I changed it.
Well, I look forward to watching this back, because I liked it, because well, to be really honest, what it did, Jerry, was it validated something that I might have been thinking, this thing over here, to shit, this really fucking matters. And the box is only in this filing cabinet to my right, this one here with a plant on it. And, I look forward to finding the time to go back again and look through it. And I'll report back and tell you how that felt, because it feels like it might be a different experience.
What I was trying to do was to tell a story and think of you almost as a character in the story, so that you could then see the truth that was actually hidden behind this is self-indulgent.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Because there was the point about, being in pandemic lockdown, we are confronted daily with the potential of death.
Yeah.
That's why we're in lockdown.
Yeah.
So we don't die.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. One thing that we have in common, I guess, is that I was connected to you and drawn to you by your story. And what I love in this, which really speaks to me, is your total openness and honesty and vulnerability. And although I've written a few books, I haven't yet written the book that does that. But I stood on stage in a special barn where, rumor has it, you'll be standing very soon, on the west of Wales, the Do Lectures in 2015, and very grateful to David Hyatt for giving me the opportunity to stand up and tell my real story. And I got so much from that, I learned so much, I should say, from that, about what happens when you stand up and reveal yourself in that way. And I'm a great advocate for founders, entrepreneurs, leaders, people in their work life, whatever stage they're at, about how they might reveal themselves, but always being careful to look after their psychological safety. And I know that you work a lot with founders, and indeed, your backstory back at Flatiron Partners and as a venture capitalist working in that entrepreneurial space. And I know when you talk about story and to founders and entrepreneurs in a lot of communities, often there is a tendency for entrepreneurs and founders to stand up and say, yeah, this is my journey, and look at me and what I've done. And there isn't always, it's getting better, but that isn't always that willingness to open up and to shine a light on what I know you've called the fullness, the glory, and the mess of our lives. I love those words from you. And I just wonder what advice you've got for people that might be watching this, who are founders, about how they can have the courage to shine a light on their real story, whether that's a Medium post, a blog post, or an opportunity where they're doing a presentation or pitching or whatever.
There's a lot I would say, so I'll try to contain it a little bit. I tend not to use the words vulnerability or authenticity.
Okay.
I tend to use the phrase "be real."
Right.
And because what I'm trying to do is to convey that there's something dishonest about the presentation of oneself in a particular form. And you made note about the psychological safety that is necessary for me to stand up on a stage in a barn and tell my truth. Well, there's a corollary psychological safety that happens in the audience. When the person who holds power, and when you're standing on a stage, you're holding power in the audience. When you're holding a seat as CEO, when you're the leader in an organization, you hold power. When that person is willing to be real, you create safety for everybody else in the room. And in that psychologically safe space, trust arises. So when I stand up as a CEO of a startup and I say, we're crushing it, everything is great, what I'm doing is I'm making it actually psychologically unsafe for the people that work with me to take the necessary risks to innovate. Because they all know You're not crushing it. As I like to say, no one's crushing it. No one is getting it right every single moment of every single day. Life is a roller coaster. We are emotionally right up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down. And when we pretend otherwise, we make it really, really difficult for someone who's struggling with that roller coaster. Because then the story they tell themselves is that I feel bad, so I must be broken. And here's a truth. You're not broken. You're just human. And that's the glory in the mess, being human.
Oh, amen. I love that. Thank you. Hey, look, we're nearly up for time. You know, when I was looking at your bio, and I know the story that you've told in your book, and the story you've told in interviews, and the story you've told me when we've spoken, this story of the boy from Brooklyn, and the story of the high-flying venture capitalist, and that journey, that trajectory to where you are now as co-founder of Reboot, and what you're doing with the leadership development firm and your coaching work and all the rest of it. I mean, I just kind of think, shit, what a story. I mean, in the writing of Reboot, the book, were you able to stand back and go, wow, what a story? Or, you're just too close to it to get that sense of it? I don't want to romanticize anything, Jerry. I mean, shit, it's a real story, the roller coaster or whatever. And there's so much there. But I can't help but make that comment about, what a rich story it is. And I know it's a story of struggle and a story of reinvention, a story of finding one's purpose. And now you are, as a leader and someone who provides so much comfort and direction to a lot of people. I know that from how warmly people feel about you. And I just wonder that reflection from you on the Jerry Colonna story.
So, nah, I don't look at it like that. I'll bring your attention back to the story I told in chapter 9 about stumbling upon that toppled over oak tree, and really coming to grips with the question of, have I been a good man? Am I a good man? And I think on the one hand, it could be sort of neurotic to not really be able to internalize the truth of your own journey. And on the other hand, there's a humility associated with that, which I'd rather live in that realm. I don't want to take myself all that seriously. That's like a danger zone. But I have come to understand that there is something compelling about the journey of my life, which is its unexpected twists and turns. There is the story of the boy who got out, of the life that he had in Brooklyn, and now lives on a farm outside of Boulder, Colorado. But there's a story implicit in that, is the story of who took Brooklyn with him, because Brooklyn's still in my heart, and it will be forever. And if you got a problem with that, we can step outside, because that's what we do in Brooklyn.
Well, what can I say? Jerry Colonna on a farm in Boulder, Colorado, with Brooklyn in his heart. Thank you so much for joining me on Meet the Storytellers. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you for your friendship, and thank you for writing me a handwritten letter a year ago.
Thank you.